Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In today's bonus author interview, I sit down with Martyn Rady, and we talk about his most recent book, The Middle Kingdoms, A New History of Central Europe. This is an ambitious book, to say the least. It covers, almost 2,000 years of history for an area that is one of the largest in Europe. So Central Europe is always forgotten, but it's really important to keep it in mind, especially sort of the crossroads of Europe. And it's, of course, in the news even still today. So I'm going to sit down with Martyn Rady today and talk about the book. We're not going to get all the way through it. It is over 500 pages in length as it sits here next to me right now. Covers a lot of different topics. I had hoped to get to Napoleon. We didn't get to Napoleon. We got to the 30 Years' War instead. But we're starting with Rome and the influences of the Huns. So I guess that's still kind of an accomplishment. Before we get started here, just a quick reminder, all the links in the show notes, as there always will be, and a link to purchase the book there is present as well. So without further ado then, on to the interview. All right, as I mentioned, I'm sitting down with historian Martyn Rady. Rady, did it that wrong the first time. Got it. So we're talking about his book, The Middle Kingdoms, which is about Central Europe, which is the part of Europe that was never discussed when I was a history major in college. It was just sort of, there's France and England and Germany at some point, and then I think there's some countries, in the middle there, but we're never going to talk about those. So a good breath of fresh air with this topic today, but I was hoping by joining us you could start out by at least defining what we mean when we say Central Europe, because I'm not sure everybody's on the same page on that one.
Well, Central Europe does tend to differ a little depending upon who you're talking to. The earliest reference to Central Europe was called in German Mitteleuropa, and the earliest reference to Mitteleuropa that I found is from 1805, and it really is the area between France and Russia, and that is what the author, a man called George Hassel, described it as. That area, that part of Europe that isn't in Turkish occupation, as the Balkans, most of the Balkans was, that area between, if you like, the Rhine and the Russian frontier. Now, of course, these are this is a political description that he gives. He references states. He goes beyond that and says Central Europe is the free bit of Europe, which isn't under French absolutism and isn't under Russian autocracy. It's the nice part of Europe, if you like. And that was more or less the definition of Central Europe that prevailed right through to the Second World War. It always had Germany in it. Poland was there, or it wasn't there, depending upon whether Poland actually existed. Hungary was there, Bohemia, the Czech Republic, they were there. Austria was always there. People weren't sure what to do with Belgium and the Netherlands. I have, in my book, left out Belgium and the Netherlands, but I have included Frisia, and I've made largely the Rhine frontier and Poland the limits of the book, and not going very much into the Balkans, although I do discuss Slovenia and Croatia.
Well, and it's worth pointing out immediately that the book covers about 2,000 years-ish of history, and so I think you're well within your rights not to include the Balkans, or, it would have been, 800 pages and not 500, 600 pages. But, this is Western Civ Podcast, so it's time for the obligatory Rome questions. Let's go back to the Roman Empire, because that is kind of, to an extent, where the book sort of begins to get into the history of Central Europe. And I don't think most people think of Central Europe when they think of Rome. I think you probably think of Western Europe, you think of Italy, and you do think of the Balkan states and so on and so forth. But Central Europe, most of my listeners probably consider a little bit too far afield. But I think it's worth wondering for a moment, was there Roman influence in this area of Central Europe as we have just defined it just now? And, to what extent was that prevalent during the Roman period?
It is surprising how much actually of Central Europe is within the Roman Empire. The boundaries of the Roman Empire are essentially the Rhine and the Danube, and that includes quite a large chunk of Western Germany. It includes a large chunk of Austria. Switzerland was also included. And then, of course, as one goes down the Danube, one hits what is now Romania, Transylvania. That was incorporated in the Roman Empire. And of course, the other point about the Roman Empire is that we tend to think in terms of sort of lines on maps, but influence is far more important. And there are two different types of influences. The first is military influence. The Roman Empire is operating way beyond its borders. There are forts, Roman forts built in Czech Republic. There's massive fortifications on the Great Hungarian Plain between the province of Dacia and the province of Pannonia, the bit that lies outside the Roman Empire, according to all the maps. There are huge fortifications. There's a sort of Hadrian's Wall, earthwork wall that's built to keep back the tribe of the Sarmatians. So there's a lot of military influence as well. But the cultural influence is important. The barbarian tribes living beyond the border, they want access to Rome. They want access to the wealth of the Roman Empire. And having destroyed the Roman Empire, they nevertheless are aware of the monumental legacy of it. And it's, one has to bear in mind that we talk about the Holy Roman Empire. Its official name was the Roman Empire, and it is as the Roman Empire that it existed right through to the beginning of the 19th century. And we call them Holy Roman Emperors. They thought of themselves as Roman emperors in direct line of, if you like, ideological descent from the old Roman emperors of ancient Rome. So the influence, military and cultural, is quite significant, I think.
Yeah, sometimes I do think, rather, that's one of the most damaging things that we do for especially younger history students is show them a map that's colored in with lines and say, okay, well, these people lived on this side of the line and these people lived on that side of the line, which, of course, in pre-modern history is ludicrous at any time that you're trying to say it. But it also just, sometimes we oversimplify things to such a strong extent that we end up actually not telling the truth anymore, when there was a lot of interaction between areas well beyond the Rhine, well beyond the Danube, even in the Roman imperial period, and just coloring this section of the map red and saying this is Roman, this isn't, is, again, one of those oversimplifications that I don't think does us any justice. But of course, one of the reasons for the ultimate collapse of the Roman Empire are those barbarian incursions, and one of the impetus for the movement of people, are some of those, and we'll talk about a couple of these groups today, but these steppe riders who come in from the east. And, if I'm talking about the Romans, of course, I'm talking about the Huns. And so I think it's worth talking about for a second, how important were these incursions of horse archer steppe peoples who would, from time to time, sort of like a hurricane, almost sort of blow into Central Europe?
I think they're absolutely critical, really, in determining the shape and the history of Central Europe. And it carries on all the way through, really, to the 18th century, in the form of the Tartars of the steppe, who are a constant problem and dislocating force in large parts of Central Europe right through to the 18th century, particularly in the slave trade that emerges in that part of the world. They go in, the Tartars go in, and force a militarization of the society in order to defend them, defend against these people. But going back to the Huns, I mean, the Huns bring down the Roman Empire. That's a big statement. There are 140 reasons given by historians for the collapse of the Roman Empire, and any of your listeners who are interested can go into Wikipedia, and every one of them is listed with due reference points. But I think one could say that, yes, there are all sorts of reasons why the Roman Empire fell. Its dependence upon slavery, maybe Christianity made people soft and removed the martial edge of the Roman Empire. But I think if one looks at it in terms of sort of short-term causes, the short-term cause is the eruption of the Huns. The Huns are a completely new force. Nobody really knows much about them. They're related to what appears to be a group called the Xiongnu, who are active a couple of centuries before on the Chinese border. Then they go quiet. Nobody knows what happens in the intervening period. And suddenly, in the 4th century, they're on the Western Steppe land. And on the Western Steppe, they start pushing the two groups. They're both called Goths. They're the Turving and the Greutung Goths, and the Huns push them into the Roman Empire. And that, starting in 378 AD, when a Roman army is defeated by, in a sense, these refugees from the Huns, from that point on, the Roman Empire is in decline. And the Roman Empire will be brought down effectively by the eruption of barbarian tribes who, like some sort of domino effect, are pushed by the Goths and take occupation of Italy. It is a very sad event. There's some historians who play down the impact of the barbarian invasions on Rome and talk about the strong continuities. Well, if you look hard enough, I'm sure you can find the continuities. People weren't so sure that there were continuities around in the 4th and 5th centuries. But the most signal thing is there is hot running water stops in 450 AD. It stops in Central Europe and stops in the 5th century, and it will not be until about 1460 that it recommences. So you can't get a hot bath in Central Europe for 1,000 years, and that is the effect of the barbarian invasions.
And an important effect, let's say that for sure. But you make a good point there that I just want to make sure that the listeners pick up on, because one of the things that's so critical about Central Europe, and it's evident in the book very much as sort of a thread that runs throughout, is that Central Europe is very much this sort of crossroads area where different cultures are meeting. And you talk about the Huns coming through and other steppe peoples and how that forces the militarization of those people who are there to try to defend themselves against them. And I think that that's an important theme throughout the book and throughout history of civilizations being impacted by each other, almost like pieces of hot metal that are pounded together. It changes both of them every time that they're struck in some sort of a way. And in this case, it's very true to sort of talk about, yes, we have this domino effect that's going on, but as the Huns come in, there's no Hunnic Empire that develops after the Roman Empire. It doesn't matter. It's already transforming the civilizations that it is having these sort of interactions with in both a short-term and a long-term basis. Well, let's jump forward because we can't talk about Rome the whole time. But I could, but let's not. So I'm always sort of struck by this moment in history, and I was taught this years and years ago that, the dissolution and the breaking apart of Charlemagne's empire after his death is, a lot of times you'll still go to a history book and it'll say the birth of modern Europe in this chapter, and then they'll show you the map. This is how the empire was divided, and you can look at it and say like, okay, yeah, I guess that kind of starts to look like modern Europe a little bit, based off of these, again, lines that we've drawn. But is this are we seeing the birth of modern Central Europe in the 10th century? I don't know. Like, is it fair in any way, shape, or form to sort of make this blanket statement?
Just to go back a bit, I mean, you're quite right about the Huns. They don't leave an empire. But some of the people they throw up, some of the other nomads are there. And you've got one nomadic tribe will establish itself in Bulgaria. They are called the Bulgars, and they will merge with the Slavs and become the Bulgarians. In Central Europe, in the area of modern-day Hungary and going over into Eastern Austria, you have the Avar Empire, which is the great unknown empire, and that exists from the 6th century right through to the beginning of the 9th century. That is a long period of time for an empire to exist. And farther to the east, including Crimea, you have the Khazar Empire, which is remarkably an empire run by a Jewish elite. So you're dealing with a shape of Europe that really is very unfamiliar. And I think it's quite misleading to look at the breakup of the Charlemagne's empire and say, aha, we can begin to see something more like modern Europe beginning, because farther over in the east, you've got some very odd creations indeed that are existing there. And I deal in the book with certainly the Avars and say they are a group that needs to be better known. I mean, they have some quite remarkable artifacts and gold, wonderful gold, and enamel jewellery and dinner services, effectively, and tureens, ewers. There's a tremendous culture there. I think the crucial development is not so much the breakup of Charlemagne's empire, but the way it's reconstituted in the 10th century. And Charlemagne's empire disappears. The title of emperor goes. The descendants of Charlemagne, they all die out. And it is left to the so-called Saxon rulers of what is now looking much more like Germany, East Francia. It is left to them to reconstitute the empire, and they become the new emperors. They take over the title of Roman emperor, and they create a new polity that will endure, and that is much more recognisably something German, and starts using the German language.
Yeah, and let's talk about that then, because I think that, and listeners will probably know it from the book as the Holy Roman Empire. That's sort of the big title that gets hoisted upon it. As you mentioned, they would have thought of themselves as Roman emperors, but that does start to look like Germany. And the more I've read about, again, I'll say Holy Roman Empire, just so that it's clear what I'm talking about for someone who's just started listening. But it seems to me that polity, that kingdom, has had more of a profound impact on Europe than oftentimes it's given credit for. And so I was wondering if you could talk about the empire for a moment, and just how did it come to be, and why is it important for us to remember?
I don't know. In terms of, what should we think about it? I think the important thing is that it provides, shall we say, a space for sub-states to develop. What really happens with the Holy Roman Empire is that it is based upon dynasties, and those dynasties have got land bases. And those land bases gradually get eroded. And in order to maintain their power, the successive kings of Germany, who become emperors of Germany, the successive rulers grant more and more rights to their vassals. And ultimately, they give them effectively political independence. So as a consequence, we get emerging within the space of the Holy Roman Empire a mass of new states. Some of them are actually Slavonic states in origin, like Mecklenburg and Brandenburg, and they will become premier German states. Others like Saxony and Bavaria and ultimately Austria will likewise maintain their own separate existence. In the case of Austria, it will take over the government of the Holy Roman Empire in the 15th century. And this means that each of these separate polities is involved partly in a competitive struggle, partly in a cooperative struggle, in order to establish their power. And one of the ways they will do that is by moving eastwards to the virgin lands, if you like, of Slavonic settlement lying to the east. And they will gradually take over that area. I mean, we have to remember that at one point, Slavonic settlement reached to what is now Holstein, just next to Denmark. All of that was Slavonic territory and is gradually rolled back, and new German states are founded, or old German states extend into these territories and build them up in a vast colonial enterprise. And this is, I think, is the achievement of the Holy Roman Empire, to actually provide a space whereby these states can advance and move forward. But there's more to it than that. At times when there is a common danger, the Holy Roman Empire and Holy Roman emperors are able to use the weight of their office in order to coordinate the defense of the region and push against Turks, against Louis XIV. So in a sense, the Holy Roman Empire does still have some sort of meaning, even at the time, right into the early modern period, when it is thought of invariably as in total disarray and decay.
Yeah, I think that those are really valid points. I read once years ago, and I can't remember the name of the author, talking about the importance of, in the Holy Roman Empire, as opposed to, like, say, maybe the Kingdom of France or England, you have, an itinerant court with more of an itinerant capital system. So the emperor is going to different diets in different locations. And so, different cities remain almost of equal importance in the empire, whereas in France, Paris develops as the main central capital later on as we're going, and that independence, and I'll come back to that later when we talk about the Reformation, because I think that really matters when we get to a topic like that. But thinking first about another one of those moments when maybe the Holy Roman Empire has to provide large-scale stability, you'd have to think about a very surprising moment for Europeans, certainly, which would be the arrival of the Mongols from the east. And I think that those of us who look more at Western European history, we don't think about them as much as maybe we should, but certainly the Mongols, I'm guessing, had a profound impact on Central Europe, correct?
I think it has a profound effect on parts of Central Europe. I mean, the Mongols are not particularly interested in going into Central Europe. They've got enough on their plate, as it were, dealing with the Western steppe. And their main interest is to reduce the Russian principalities to a subservient status as providers of tribute and of conscripts. So that's their main target. What happens is that they send envoys to throughout Western Europe because they believe that the Khans are the world leaders, and they demand that everybody bows down to them. And many rulers just write pleasant things back and leave it at that. But unfortunately, Bela IV, the King of Hungary, slays the Mongol envoys. Now, this is a very, very unwise move, because the murder of envoys is never a good idea at any point. There's always been some notion of diplomatic status that is attached to envoys. And Batu Khan, who is the grandson of Genghis Khan, if I remember correctly, Batu Khan, who sent the envoys, just goes and launches a full-scale attack on Hungary. His geography is not very good. He doesn't quite understand who's allied to whom, so he also ravages southern Poland. But he ravages southern Poland because he's involved in a pincer movement on Hungary with different armies crossing the Carpathians in order to capture King Bela IV. And Bela IV knows they're after him and ends up hiding on a Dalmatian island. And the Mongols occupy Hungary for a year. Unfortunately, in this case, the Holy Roman Empire is not involved in much coordination because Hungary is outside the Holy Roman Empire. And in fact, it does nothing when the ruler of Austria helps himself to a bit of Hungarian territory in the disarray. But following the Mongol invasion and the retreat of the Mongols, they've run out of food because the Hungarian plain is not a very good supplier of grass. It doesn't have as much fodder as people imagine. They have to retreat after about a year, and it's left to Bela IV to rebuild his kingdom. And what he does is he engages in a process of about 20 years what states and countries and regions and lands across Europe have been doing over a period of several centuries. He actually, for want of a better word, modernizes or feudalizes the kingdom. He builds cities, calls in Germans with big tax concessions to found cities, and gets them to build city walls. And the city walls around Budapest, the city walls are something like 5 kilometres long, and they're put up in about 20 to 30 years. This is an extraordinary effort by Bela IV and by the citizens he's called in to help him. More particularly as well, he gets rid of the existing system of military recruitment and awards land to servicemen, to essentially knights. He builds up a class of knights, giving them land with the idea that they can buy heavy armour. And so Hungary gets knighthood and chivalry and all of the things that go with our understanding of the Middle Ages. Before that time, Hungary was a pretty primitive place with a fairly basic system of administration. Bela IV, as a consequence of the Mongol invasion, transforms Hungary and makes it into a state comparable to any of its neighbours and Western counterparts. It becomes a recognisably Christian and Western-looking state. The same process is going on in parts of Poland in particular, where you've got tremendous competition amongst various claimants to the throne, and you get the same type of stress on knighthood, building up feudal retinues, allocating resources to a new class of warrior, building cities, all of this process, which is in Hungary is complete within 20 years, takes longer in places like Poland and Bohemia, but it's underway there as well. So the Mongols, I think, have a tremendous effect on Hungary, but they show as a consequence of the way they act just what type of transformation is happening in Central Europe round about the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries.
Yeah, and again, another great example of a civilization being impacted by an invasion and being forced to, as you say, modernize and develop the nation state even more. I want to talk about one group here, and that's the Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights are probably one of those groups that, when I talk about them, I find that people sort of colloquially have heard of them. They have some sense that they're some way tangentially related to the Crusades, and that they're German. And then sort of beyond that, they don't really know what they were. But they're really interesting. And the fact that they come relatively close compared to the other military orders to creating this sort of permanent state is interesting to me. So I was hoping you could talk about them and the role that the Teutonic Knights play in the development of Central Europe for a little while, because I find them interesting. I think that people would too.
Yeah, I mean, the one has these crusader orders that exist in the Eastern Mediterranean. Some, like the Hospitallers, manage to create their own states at Rhodes, and it lasts until the 16th century. And of course, then there's the Hospitaller state of Malta, which survives until Napoleon comes on the scene. The Teutonic Knights are the most successful in the sense that they've got the largest state complex built by crusading knights. The Teutonic Knights are monks. They don't have tonsures. They have helmets instead. They're a militarized monk force. They do all the prayers. They may have to do them on horseback as they're riding into battle, but they do the divine offices. They live in dormitories. They are celibate. They are dedicated to the Virgin Mary. So they are very holy people, but they carry swords as well, and their aim is to fight the infidel. Originally, it was to provide hospitals, and they provide hospitals right through until the order still exists, and they still are providers of succour and aid. But their primary function becomes the war against the unbeliever. And the unbeliever in the 13th century, the unbeliever is in Prussia. And the Prussians are not the last group to become converted to Christianity in Central Europe. They're the second or third group. We've got the Lithuanians that I'll come on to. The Prussians are attacking Poland, and the Polish Duke Conrad of Mazovia calls in the Teutonic Knights for assistance. Now, the Teutonic Knights have previously been looking for a role, and they had accepted an invitation to fight the Cuman nomads in Transylvania, and they build various fortresses, they move people in, and then the King of Hungary decides he doesn't want them in after all. He's going to use the Franciscans to convert the Cumans peacefully. And so they find themselves kicked out, and they're very aggrieved about this because they've spent a lot of money. So when Conrad of Mazovia appeals to them, they lay down conditions, and they lay down conditions that they will have the territories that they're given and the territories that they conquer will be theirs, and they will be allowed to do what they like with them. And so they establish themselves in, I suppose one could call it, the northeast corner of Europe, just south of the Baltic, where they eliminate, first of all, the Prussians. They have a hard job doing so. The Prussians are fairly primitive fighters, but they pick up techniques of warfare very rapidly, capture large numbers of knights, and engage in the very pleasant pastime of roasting Teutonic knights alive in their armour. So the Teutonic Knights establish themselves in Prussia. They then move on to fight the next group, which are the last surviving pagan group in Europe, and that is the Lithuanians, who occupy a vast space reaching from the Baltic all the way down to the Black Sea. Lithuania is today very small indeed. Its territory in the 14th century was extraordinarily extensive. It's the largest state in Europe. And the Teutonic Knights are involved with fighting the Prussians and then fighting the Lithuanians. There are about 1,000 knights in all operating on the, if you like, in the Baltic area. So there's not very many. And what they have to do is they feudalise their territories in much the same way as happened in Hungary and in Poland. They grant land to knights to come over and to assist in their wars, and they offer essentially action-packed tourist holidays where warriors from the West come over and spend a season or two campaigning alongside them, fighting Prussians and more particularly Lithuanians. And in the book, I actually go into the future Henry IV of England, who goes over and fights on the side of the Teutonic Knights against the Lithuanians. He spends a vast amount of money because the Prussians, the Teutonic Knights, are not just interested in the military muscle of the people coming in from the West, they're interested in how they can get them to spend money. And they have lavish feasts, great entertainments with minstrels, no girls because the knights are celibate. There are no girls, but there's plenty of drinking and boozing and exchanging gifts. And the Teutonic Knights continue in that manner until they are eventually defeated by the Poles. The Poles have had enough of them. The Teutonic Knights continue warring against the Lithuanians, even after the Lithuanians have converted to Christianity and have actually joined together with Poland in 1385 to found a joint state under a common ruler. And the Poles turn on the Teutonic Knights and defeat them and force them into making some type of peaceable settlement with them. But the real turning point, which leads on, I think, probably to your next question, the real turning point comes in 1525 when the Teutonic Knight Grand Master, Albrecht of Hohenzollern, decides to become a Protestant, a Lutheran. And what he does is he gives up all of the monkish aspects of the Teutonic Knights' activity. He establishes himself as the ruler of Prussia, and he makes all the knights into his landowners and landholding class. And this is the great secularization, as it's called, of the Teutonic Order, when it loses its religious aspect and becomes, if you like, a feudal state.
It's a good point because there's actually a couple of things there. I mean, first of all, I hope if you're listening to this, if you didn't know how large Lithuania was in the 14th century, go look at a map because it is an enormous state at this point in Europe. And the thing about the Teutonic Knights that, as I was researching them, struck me is that, yes, it was one of these groups that rulers were very happy to be accommodating to them while they needed them. But as we would see in Transylvania, with the King of Hungary, and then later on they run afoul of the Poles and so on and so forth, it's this group that they decide, well, I don't know that this is as useful for us anymore in the sort of the shifting alliances that are taking place. But they don't as you say, they don't disappear. It's more of a transition. And the transition then does have a lot to do with the next topic, which is the Reformation. Because I don't think you can talk about Central Europe without talking about the bombshell that was the Reformation. And I just don't, personally, I just don't know if the Reformation plays out the way that it does if Martin Luther has to live in, say, France, as opposed to one of the German states. Again, and that goes back to that freedom that was granted to the different participating dukes, kings, so on and so princes, so on and so forth of the Holy Roman Empire. So how important is Central Europe to the story of the Reformation? And is there any, I don't know, is there any credence to my hypothesis that we owe Central Europe to a large extent to what happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very valuable point. What would have happened if Luther had been in England or France or Italy? He would have been burnt. And that would have been the end of it, because that's what happens to people like John Tyndale, William Tyndale, the Savonarola, all these various heretics, as they were called, are captured and burnt. In the case of Luther, he is protected. He is a university professor. And Frederick the Wise of Saxony doesn't like people having a go at his professors, and he protects them. I don't think universities would do the same now. So he protects Luther, and Luther is able to produce vast amounts of writing, 80 volumes, I think, in the present edition, 80 volumes of writing, and he is assisted by the artist Cranach, who makes him into a brand and produces these scurrilous woodcuts that do so much to spread Luther's message. So that is important, the role of the Holy Roman Empire in nurturing, if you like, the Reformation. The Reformation is Central Europe, and it depends upon the shape of Central Europe for its success. But I think the critical point is that the final peace treaty that's made in the 1550s between the Protestant princes and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and his brother and successor Ferdinand, that presupposes that the princes can determine the religion of their subjects. And that is a tremendous boost to princely power. In fact, what is even more the case is how the Protestant princes in particular are keen on religious discipline and on social discipline as an aspect of that. And so the religious power they get soon becomes a power to, if you like, meddle and pry into people's lives, into their morality, into their marriages, into the way they bring up children. And so there's a tremendous social disciplining, I think is the word that historians use. There's a tremendous social disciplining that the princes engineer on the back of the Reformation, which extends their political influence and their power all the more.
It's giving Luther and then, Switzerland, which is, where we get a couple of other key reformers, John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli, as well, are sort of operating in this space. And it gives him the opportunity, and just to go back to the writing for a second, the amount of writing that Luther was able to produce is tremendous. It's almost hard to even put it into quantities for people. Like, he was, if you look at the bestsellers list of this period of European history, it would be like looking at a list and the top 5 are all things written by Martin Luther. I mean, his ability to do that is because you can't just go grab him and burn him. Okay? Jan Hus made the mistake of showing up at a court on one occasion, and that didn't end well for him. And Luther was very aware of what had happened to him. And what's another interesting thing that's happening at this exact same time is, of course, while the Reformation is going in parts of Germany and in Switzerland as well, you also have the burgeoning Ottoman state pushing in to Eastern and up to towards Vienna. And so how does Charles V and how does Central Europe try to balance this? How does he try to address this Ottoman threat while simultaneously having to deal with this ongoing Reformation?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. And in Charles V is very negligent in the 1520s. He spends his time in Spain. He's just got married. His wife is dazzlingly beautiful. And he languishes there, really, and leaves it to his brother Ferdinand to sort out the Holy Roman Empire. And Ferdinand can't do it. And Charles V turns up at Augsburg in 1530, and there's a meeting of the Diet, the Parliament of the Holy Roman Empire, and he calls together the Catholic princes and says, right, there's been too much messing around. We're going to go for it. I'm going to make war on the Protestants. And they go and say to him, you can't do that. Firstly, you haven't got enough money for troops. Secondly, the troops that you recruit are all Protestants anyway. They're not going to fight very hard for you. Thirdly, we've just had a peasants' war in Germany, and the peasants will rise up. And on top of that, the Ottomans will take advantage of any civil conflict and press further into Central Europe. And Charles has to back down. The Ottomans are there as a restraint on imperial policy, and they will always remain so. I mean, by 1550, roughly, most of the parliaments across the Holy Roman Empire, remember there's a central parliament of the Holy Roman Empire, the Reichstag, and there are parliaments in all of these provinces as well. And they control the purse strings because they're the people who know who the taxpayers are. And they're the people who've got the tax collectors out. So if you're going to get any money, you have to go through the princes and the parliaments. And the parliaments will just say to any prince who says, we're going to crack down on Protestantism, they'll simply say to him, in that case, we're not collecting any taxes. And normally they will, in places like Austria, Styria, they will couple tax to concessions on the religious front. And the main reason why princes need taxes is for military purposes in order to engage in defence, particularly against the Turks, also the French, but particularly against the Turks. So in other words, there's a direct linkage between the Ottoman Empire and its advance into Central Europe. Remember, in 1529, they're at Vienna, and they will continue being a threat on the doorstep of Central Europe for several centuries more. And they will they force a new degree of militarization in Central Europe, but militarization has to be paid for, and the Protestants control the purse strings.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there's to an extent a valid argument to be made that, who do we have to thank for the Reformation being allowed to survive those early years? One could advance an argument that, well, you should thank the Ottoman Sultan for the Reformation existing, because their very existence at that same time makes it very difficult. Sometimes, you look at a map, and this is again where maps are misleading, and you look at all the territories that are under, technically, to different extents, Charles V's, sovereignty, and you say, well, he controls all these vast areas. He's obviously so much more powerful than everybody else. But many of those areas come with problems, and those areas have to be defended, and those areas are by no means unified. There's very little interest in for people in Spain to pay for wars in Germany, and vice versa, and certainly he's got, Mexica and Inca later on, gold pouring in from the New World, but it's spent almost before it comes in. To some extent it is, I suppose, spent before it comes in because he's borrowed it already. And I imagine him as this juggler who every time he wants to take on another ball, someone reminds him that, well, if you do that, it's actually two more, just so you know, because there's these other problems. And of course, he eventually just retires and is weighed down by it so much. So it's, again, one of those ways where you would look at it and say, this man is so powerful, look at what he has. But it's not that simple. It's much more complicated than all of that. And so I think the Ottomans are an interesting question in there. Well, I don't want to run out of time here. I want to talk about the 30 Years' War for a moment, because the 30 Years' War, at least I was taught, was one of those watershed history moments in Central Europe that sort of dominates how things go from then on. So I was hoping you could speak for at least a few minutes about the 30 Years' War. How does it happen in nature, and what are some of its sort of immediate consequences for the history of Central Europe in particular?
It starts because there is an even more determined emperor than Charles V, and that is Emperor Ferdinand II. And Ferdinand II is, I suppose we would call him a fanatic. He has made a personal vow to the Virgin that he will rid his territories of Protestantism, and nothing is going to stop him. At one point early on in the 30 Years' War, he really has only Vienna left, and he's got only a minor garrison, and he is reliant upon the students under the officering of their professors in order to defend him. And what he does is he prays in the chapel in what is now the Hofburg Palace. You can see it there, and the Virgin tells him it's going to be all right, and it is, because the army that's coming to Vienna diverts in another direction. So he's saved, and he's saved by the intercession of the Virgin, which only sort of encourages him to take more and more gambles. And he will spend the next the 1620s making outrageous gambles with dispossessing rulers, demanding that Protestant princes return all the church land that they've seized, which is huge quantities of territory, trying to rebuild the Catholic Church. But ultimately he's caught out, because just as Charles V learnt at Augsburg, other people are waiting there to take advantage of his difficulties. The Swedes intervene, and more particularly the French intervene on the Protestant side effectively. And so the 30 Years' War, which starts off very much as a religious war, becomes a dynastic war fought between the House of Habsburg and the House of Bourbon in France. And so it continues long after the main causes have, in a sense, been resolved. And the deal that's put at the end is that the princes can continue to determine the religion, except whereas originally the religions that they could choose were limited to Catholicism or Lutheranism, now Calvinism is allowed in. If religious freedom is largely allowed to subjects within a number of constraints, and the courts will, from this point onwards, judge matters of religious dispute. They won't be left to the ruler, and the courts, well, they're backlogged, but it's shoving the problem of religion into the courts and taking it off the battlefield. That's the important thing. And there's an exemption for the Habsburg lands, which means Austria, Bohemia, and not Hungary at this point. Austria and Bohemia are exempt from this. They have to stay Catholic. So what happens is that you get a build-up of, if you like, a Catholic redoubt that begins to emerge in Austria and Bohemia, with Bavaria, which has long been, well, since the 1560s, 1570s, is pretty solidly Catholic. So you get a build-up of Catholic bloc in the south and east of the Holy Roman Empire. And Catholicism is saved. And that's the important point, because in 1600, 50 years before the Peace of Westphalia, Catholicism looked as if it was being outmaneuvered, as if it was going to be marginalised entirely. The 30 Years' War allows the Catholics to come back, as it were. And importantly, too, it marks really the removal of the Habsburgs from the Holy Roman Empire. The Peace of Westphalia is signed by the princes separately, under their own names. It recognises, if you like, that some sort of sovereignty attaches to them. And the role of the Habsburgs is diminished. The Habsburgs will continue to play a role in the Holy Roman Empire, but from now on it will be a diminished one, and they will increasingly look to building up their own power in their own corner of Central Europe.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a couple of important takeaways from the 30 Years' War, certainly. One of them should be, ladies and gentlemen, if somebody tells you it's all going to be okay, I just talked to the Virgin Mary and she said it was going to be fine, you should be a little suspicious, because that hasn't always particularly worked out in the long run for those who have attempted it. Well, we are running out of time, and we got to the mid-17th century. So listeners at home should know that this book is very detailed and excellent and so dense. I wrote through Napoleon, and we didn't get to Napoleon. So it's well worth picking up, and I couldn't recommend it enough. There just aren't very many good, complete histories of Central Europe out there, and this is coming from a guy who knows, because I have to read a lot of history. So if you're looking for a book that really does stitch together the major themes of Central European history and how it impacts everything else, this one is excellent. And thank you for writing it. I very much enjoyed reading it, and I'm hopeful that maybe there'll be some other works in the future that I can pick up. But thank you for coming on as well. It was really fantastic.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for listening to me.